I'm a geodesist, which means I do sort of very accurate surveying of a kind for the purposes of earth science, mostly. So I measure where things are to within a couple of millimeters and do that repeatedly and watch the ground move and deform. So that's my main area of interest. And because I'm interested in earthquakes and faults, I've also worked with LiDAR, because LiDAR is a great way of showing exactly where the geological structures are at the surface, because when you get a lot of vegetation, it obscures the geology. So I've also been doing cloud computing with my colleagues for about 4 years now. We use the AWS cloud. As it happens, there's more than one cloud. So I'm going to try to show you our experience. It's not really I'm not a farmer, and I don't really understand agriculture, but I think a lot of the things that we do will turn out to be in common. And you'll also see that there's a lot of opportunities to share databases and share software, because a lot of the things that farmers will want to do with these new geospatial sensor systems are also things that other groups are doing. In some cases, people have been doing it for years, so there's already a large software base. So the geospatial technologies, I want to talk about a little bit about positioning. I'm a GPS guy, so that's mostly what I do. But of more interest to you is satellite multispectral stereo imagery. I'm sure you've looked at some of that this morning, so I won't talk too much about that. And then the various kinds of LiDAR. This is like the big coming thing, and what's scary about it is the sheer quantity of data that you'll be collecting. So it's very, very powerful, but it's also kind of, it makes you nervous. So I'm going to talk about airborne photogrammetry and LiDAR, terrestrial photogrammetry and LiDAR, drone mapping systems. That's the big coming thing. Of course, these have to be coupled with in situ sensors. So, you know, for example, your MET station, rain gauges, how much sun's hitting the ground. This is not very stable. And so what you measure, for example, looking at the farm developing during the growing season, is going to have to be combined with other kinds of information. And eventually this will end up with machine tracking, machine sensing, and machine control. So for people that are in the geomatics industry see drones and machine control as being this tens or hundreds of billions of dollars per year industry that's just now starting up. And it will have a lot of impacts on farmers. The analogy would be, when I started doing GPS, a GPS receiver was this kind of big heavy thing that cost $150,000 and could make a measurement in say 6 hours. When GPSs were downsized to a chip level to be put into a cell phone, that caused an explosion of applications. The requirement that GPS go into the cell phone was what made small chipsets appear. And as soon as those small chipsets appeared, they had just exploded into millions of different applications. And I think that's one of my messages, is like, we're already seeing this happen in our field, and you can sort of expect it to happen in your field. One of the worrying things about all of these new sensors, like you're sensing big chunks of the planet, and you can repeatedly sense it and watch, like make movies of things, is the sheer volume of data. Most people don't want to set up their own several terabyte data set and then do software to analyze it. And so it's very attractive to look for next generation computing tools to deal with next generation data sets. And of course, the cloud is the interesting thing on the prospect. I'll talk about the cloud a little bit after I talk about the data, because it sort of makes more sense to do it in that order. But roughly, cloud computing gives you a lot of ease of entry into the field. You don't need to buy gigantic computer rooms full of people and technicians and air conditioners and all this infrastructure. You can just buy what you can just enter and buy what you need, rent what you need. It's very scalable, so you can start small and you can blow up big. It leads to rapid results. So this is often referred to as time to insight, especially if you're doing software development like I do. It's important that when you change the software, you get the results back quickly so you can see the results of what it is you're thinking about. If it takes, 3 months to do the computation, you'll have forgotten in 3 months why you were doing this experiment. Security is another big one. Leveraging the best practices of industry. These cloud groups, be they AWS or Microsoft, their engineers are like the best software engineers in the world. So you can take advantage of that expertise, and they will do a lot of things for you that you don't need to learn about. So you're probably talking about digital globe at some point. There's the Worldview 4 was supposed to have been launched already, but it's still in the launch pad after a delay. And it's the 4th Worldview satellite. And this is only one of about 15 or 20 satellites in their overall constellation. Worldview 4 is going to have a panchromatic resolution of 31 centimeters. That used to be illegal to sell data with that fine a footprint because of the security implications. But the military has now cleared the satellite companies to release extremely high resolution data. So 31 centimeters is pretty good. Actually, in the visible and near infrared, it's somewhat worse. It's 1.24 meters. It can collect in stereo, as that little video just showed you, which means you can make DEMs. And the repeat time for basic imaging is 1 day, and for like much more complex types of imaging is about 4 days. So it's sort of something you can do on demand. One of the nice things about this imagery is already geolocated, so the image, even a 3D image, will be in the right place and have the right orientation. The translational errors might be 4 meters, so that if you have like one known control point at the place, like the antenna on top of the farm, you can just move it over and everything will be right. The quantity of data these things are collecting is astonishing. So this satellite can collect 680,000 square kilometers of data per day. So you just imagine how much data that is. And this has been used now for quite a few years in the geoscience community. One of the biggest volume applications is studying the ice sheets, their movement, and the effect of climate change. So here you see a glacier coming in, and that dark line, sort of crescent line, is the front of the glacier, and then all those little dots, those are the icebergs floating in the water. So that's a glacier entering. One of the nice things about these DEMs is they're mathematical surfaces, so you can differentiate them, you can compute the curvature, you can do mathematical operations on them. You can see how much the surface has moved down. That's how much material you've lost. So the NSF set up the Polar Geospatial Center at University of Minnesota, and it's collecting stereo images of all of Antarctica and all of Greenland, and they get 100% coverage every day. I don't know if you know, but Antarctica is much bigger than the United States. And this is just being done as a science project. Right now, their archive is over a petabyte, which is a 1024 terabytes, or 1 million gigabytes. They've run out of room, so now they're having to expand their archive. And there are dozens and dozens of scientists downloading this data, some of them processing it with off-the-shelf software, some of them, like for example at OSU, there's a guy writing his own software to analyze this kind of data. So this is kind of revolutionizing certain branches of glaciology. Here's an interesting thing happened in one of my projects. We noticed a depression that looks like a mitten, right? It was like a hole, kind of a hole in the surface. And as we went over, we noticed that the hole was filling up. The ice surface was rising, rising, rising. And in the end, it was sort of, not quite flat, but a lot of the way back. And And we realized that what happened was a subglacial lake had drained, the surface had collapsed. And then when the melting started, the water's trickling down, refilling the glacier and lifting the surface back up. Right, so it is sort of showing you this is a surprise, but there's hundreds and hundreds of different phenomena being illuminated by these time repeat DEMs. They're basically four-dimensional surveys, the 3 dimensions of space and one more in time. So these are making enormous impacts on climate change and glaciology, and I think they're going to make soon. This kind of impact is going to spread to many different disciplines. For example, in terms of a one-time or once every 10 years map of a farm, you could make a stereo DEM and you could classify the farm. You wouldn't need to do that very often unless your fields are changing a lot. But then afterwards, you would probably not be worried about DEM. You'd just be doing multispectral representations to look for things like disease in the plants. So I think you've probably talked about multispectral satellite images, and there are many, many different satellites that can do this, and they have different resolutions. So like at first glance, it might seem that there's too many of these satellites, and how can they all survive? But they all have different characteristics. So you choose the appropriate satellite for the appropriate problem. And in some cases, you can actually make combinations of satellite images and extract something out of the combination that you can't extract with just one of the satellites. I want to talk about LiDAR because I think this is the sort of emerging technology that exemplifies the explosion of information that's about to occur. So in this particular case, it's a helicopter with a LiDAR. Quite often it's an airplane. That has got a LiDAR on it, and it has an inertial measurement unit, which you can integrate sort of like inertial guidance on a jumbo jet. And that enables you to take up the small bumps and jogs and twists and turns of the aircraft. And the GPS positions the aircraft at the 1 second time scale, the IMU is doing most of the work. At the 2 minute time scale, the GPS is doing most of the work. But they're analyzed together to get the most complete solution for the trajectory of the aircraft and also its orientation, so that movements of the aircraft do not map into an incorrect DEM of the ground. The thing that makes LiDAR so unique is that you can separate the vegetation from the ground. So this is what attracted geologists to it 10 years ago, and the geologists and the archaeologists have been the single biggest users. So the laser is pulsing, and there's a sort of a camera device or a detector counting the returns, but it doesn't just count the first return. Typically it counts the first 4 or 5. Depends on the machine, on the particular device. But it counts multiple returns. Often the last one will be the ground. And so when you bathe these, when I started, LiDARs made 60,000 pulses per second. Now they're making more like 300,000 pulses per second on each of 3 channels, a total of 900,000 pulses per second. And on each pulse, you can get more than one return. So this is a fantastic amount of data. But you can use the software to recognize, okay, this is the ground. There's this continuous thing at the bottom of the LiDAR point cloud. That's the ground. And then once you've been able to sense the ground, you can separate the ground from the vegetation, and you can strip off the trees and make bare earth. So that picture on the left is the bare earth DEM constructed from the point cloud on the right. Once you know where the bare earth is, then you can classify the vegetation by its height above the ground. And so it's very common to color code the vegetation according to how high it is above the bare earth surface. And of course, one person's signal is another person's noise. So for the geologist, the vegetation is noise, and it's something to be eliminated. Actually, I'm sympathetic to this because as a GPS guy, I hate trees near my GPS antennas. They ruin my signals. So I'm always looking for a place without trees. But of course, for a forester or for a farmer, the interest is in the biomass. And so now there are quite a few research groups developing methodologies to extract the most amount of information about the biomass as possible from a given LED point cloud. This is a clip from a group, Schuland and others, that were doing a LiDAR survey in Australia. And their interest is not in the geology, but in the biomass. So you can see how they color code the tree according to its height above the ground. The ground is the blue color. It's not a constant elevation because the ground itself has got topography. But everywhere the ground is blue. You can see the fabric of the bark on the trees sometimes when you go by. And you think you can see the leaves, but of course you're probably not seeing all of them. So then one of the games of people that are doing these biomass calculations is to figure out how representative of the point cloud of all of the leaves. It won't get all of them unless you do something special. I'll get to that later on. You actually can end up getting every leaf if you don't use an airplane or a helicopter. So the airborne kind, this nearly always goes in an airplane. This is one of the top of the line LiDARs by Optech. It's a Canadian company. This is their Titan. So it's got 3 lasers in 3 different colors. One can go through water, so it can actually map water depths up to about 30 meters depth, so the water's fairly clear, which can be quite useful if you're near the coast or rivers or got a lake or a pond. And then there's a near infrared and a further far infrared. So with these 3 colors, you can characterize the ground, a shallow submarine environment, and also vegetation. This collects vast quantities of data. So this thing can collect easily a terabyte in a day's work. But they're expensive. They cost about $1 million. So typically small groups don't use these, but they are purchased by survey companies that then sell services to individual customers, including California farmers. Large corporations, groups that do mining, for example, and government agencies. The government, for example, is using these things to map flood zones at coasts. If the sea rises by 10 feet in a storm surge, exactly what will be flooded. So the big advantages of the airborne LiDAR is very large amounts of data. So if you need huge amounts of data, this is actually the most cost-effective way of doing it. It's got a very good perspective because it's looking down. It's not always the best place to look, but if you can only choose one direction, it's normally better to be looking down than looking in any other direction. It can fly, for example, a county in a day. So although it's expensive, it might cost somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 a day to rent this airplane and the LiDAR and then get the data back. But if enough people divide the cost, it's actually more inexpensive than most of the other ways of mapping. The downside, though, is that it's still somewhat expensive. $50,000 to $100,000 a day is not an insignificant cost. There are other types of LiDAR. This is the tripod LiDAR. Sometimes it's called terrestrial LiDAR, but terrestrial LiDAR now has got a wider meaning. The tripod LiDAR is only one kind of terrestrial LiDAR. It's much cheaper. These instruments cost anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000, depending on their bells and whistles, their range, and so forth. It's got certain advantages. It can scan a cliff. If you're flying over a cliff, you can't scan it, but if you're next to a cliff, you can scan it sideways. You can go around the corner and scan the other side of the cliff. And then, given common points, there's software that will combine the 2 clouds. So you can actually scan something from 4 or 5 directions, have no shadowing at all, capture the entire thing in 3 dimensions, and have it joined up as a single point cloud. The disadvantages is that actually not that optimal for horizontal services. Right? Because, for example, suppose you're trying to image a field of wheat, after a while the light won't get through because there's just too much wheat in the line of sight. It's better to be looking down. There are some systems that have a truck with a piston that pushes a platform about 40 feet up in the air, and on top of that platform is a LiDAR, and then it can point down and do a certain radius, and then you move it around and you can cover it that way. So that's something that some people are doing. The maximum range of these LiDARs is sort of like a kilometer usually. Some of them go up to a mile. Mobile LiDARs are really growing fast too. So this is terrestrial because it's ground bound, but it's moving. So it usually is better than a tripod LiDAR in the sense that it's got an IMU, which a tripod LiDAR does not. And some of these vehicles have as many as 5 LiDARs plus fancy cameras and movie cameras, and they're just recording everything. It's like unbelievable amounts of data. Here's a picture of the LiDARs on the bottom left. There's a little window, and there's a mirror that's at 45 degrees, which bounces the light out. But the mirror spins, so it spins the light around in a circle. So it's making a helix of these points. And then you're watching the scanning. You're watching the scan growing. Just see it go around the corner in a little while. I have a colleague that's using these for earthquake research. That sounds a little strange. What he's doing is going into urban areas in California, scanning neighborhoods, and then using street poles where they intersect the ground, the corners of window frames as survey markers. So what he intends to do is go back after the earthquake, rescan the whole division, and use the built structure itself as survey markers to examine the deformation caused by the earthquake. So there's lots and lots of new applications coming all of the time. I can imagine in some modified form you could use a mobile LiDAR in a big farm or between the rows of crops. But I think for your community, probably the most interesting thing is drone LiDARs and drone photogrammetry. So this fixed wing thing on the right is already a camera system that's being used in Europe. It takes a picture, then another picture, so it takes a stereo pair. And so you can create a DEM. And now the resolution is not 30 centimeters, it's maybe 2 centimeters, 1 centimeter. And the helicopters, or the helicopter type drones, are even more amazing because they can stand still. And you can just bathe the ground with as much laser points as you like. And so in this situation, if the wind wasn't moving, you could basically map the entire biomass of a field. So that's going to be interesting. And there are research groups in various parts of the country looking into how do we use drones with cameras, how do we use drones with LiDAR, and how do we use drones with both cameras and LiDAR. These drones are very inexpensive. You can buy like a hobby drone that's really nice for $2,000, has a GPS on it. Some of the drones you can program what it will do. So you can tell it, go up and down, and you can pre-program it, giving it the GPS coordinates of all of the lines and turns, and the drone will go up and it'll repeat a pattern. So if you're doing 4D surveying where you're looking at how the biomass, for example, is changing as a function of time, you can actually view it from the same tracks in the sky. The lower down you are, the more resolution you have. If you go really low down and you go slowly, you probably reach something close to a millimeter horizontal resolution. This is going to show you one of the drones. They come in all shapes and sizes. This one actually looks like a little helicopter. So this kind of drone is being aimed at farmers. So how did I get here? I'm a GPS geologist, so I have to process GPS data from large numbers of stations, way more than 1,000, every 15 seconds, I have to estimate where they are, how the ground's moving, remove solid earth tides, remove ocean loading tides, remove the atmosphere, essentially, from the calculation. So these are very, very large computations. And so I was analyzing a global network of about 1,700 stations from early 94 to now, repeatedly. And one pass of the global, one reanalysis of the global data set was taking me 14 weeks on a dedicated cluster of 80 processors. And it was just too slow. So this is how I got into the cloud. We moved this computation into the cloud, and then we did it in 7 hours instead of 14 weeks. And the reason was, we were, on that first time we did it, we were using 10,000 cores simultaneously. This is the beauty of the cloud. You can keep scaling it up. Right now, when we do our data analyses, we are using as many as 40,000 cores at the same time. And we bid for unused cores so that we're not even paying that much money for it. So there's the ease of entry I talked about. You don't pay a lot of money. You don't build a giant supercomputer center. There's also scalability. Once you've got your algorithms go, they can get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You don't care if the data gets really much larger or the analysis becomes more complex, and so it takes later time, because you can just keep growing the size of the computational resource. That's called scalability. Time to insight. There's something very useful about being able to process a vast data set and getting the answer quickly. It's more valuable if you get the answer quickly than you have to wait a long time. Because you have to wait a long time for the answer, you lose momentum. Security is a big issue now, especially if your community wants to do shared data sets and multiple people accessing shared data sets, some of which may, for example, be licensed. You're going to have to worry about security. So my only experience in the cloud is with Amazon Web Services, but one of the obvious advantages for me is I do intermittent computing. I turn it on, I do a huge calculation, I turn it off, which means that it's on demand and it minimizes the amount of time that the system's up. Most of the time the system's off, so it can't be attacked. The AWS puts very strong safeguards in to help customer privacy. And whenever you do large-scale computing nowadays with lots of users, you're going to run into government compliance requirements that you have to do these various security compliance, and they're very burdensome. Some of them are frankly over the top, but that's the way it is. But AWS has built a lot of these security features into their software, which means that you don't have to. I mean, personally, I don't want to waste my time writing security software. So I'm very happy that AWS has made a framework in which we can put our data. It will be secure, and we don't need to worry about it. That's just one of the advantages of leveraging industry's best practices. I mean, even if you've got like the best programmer like in Columbus, it's probably not as good as the programmers at AWS or in the Microsoft cloud, because these guys have like some of the very best software engineers on the planet. And they are really good at what they do. And between them, they figured out these best practices, and you can basically inherit a lot of best practices as opposed to learn those practices yourself the hard way. There's also flexibility. So we use the Spark market. Since we do not need to be up full time like Netflix. Netflix runs on the Amazon cloud. It doesn't have its own computer centers, it runs on the cloud, but obviously it needs guaranteed computer time. Well, we don't. We come in and we buy computer time, unused things. Now, we've developed a lot of strategies to make that work, but it's a great option that we'll compute when it's cheaper to compute and not when it's expensive to compute. There's also options like glacial storage, which is not online, but it's not too far away from being online. You can store absolutely enormous data sets for very little money in glacial storage, but it takes a few days to get them connected back to you so you can recover them. So they're very good for long-term backups. They're not designed for interactive use. There are some costs, and we could probably talk about these during the panel session. You do need to modify your software to run effectively on the cloud. And we have to modify our software quite a lot. You have to modify your data structures very often. Like there's a certain, for example, it's expensive in relative terms to open a file. So you're getting charged for reading the file, but you're also getting charged for opening the file. So if you have the option of having your data in 1 million tiny files or one big file, you should do one big file. That way you avoid the million opening charges. Things like that. In the end, you may need to store your data in the cloud. So we started out thinking we were compute bound, right? So we were really doing huge calculations with small data sets. Our data sets are 1, 2, 3, 4 terabytes. I think 4 terabytes is the largest data set we've ever run with. This is not a big data set by modern standards. But we do very large calculations with them. But serving the data slowed down the process. So we figured out that something like half of the time passing was the cloud waiting for us to serve the data. So then we bit the bullet and moved the data into the cloud. But that has its advantages too. For example, it's backed up in a very professional way. Now, one of the funny things is that you're never denied access to the data. So somehow or other, they figured out a way of backing up the data while you may be using it. My experience has been that it enables us to do things that we couldn't possibly have done. Now I have reached close to the maximum size calculation before, but now I realize I can do it in the cloud much, much faster. And indeed, I can do much larger things simply by scaling the size of the process in the cloud. Now I am considering doing something that would be at least an order of magnitude larger calculation than the one I'm already doing. Right, so this is the advantage of the cloud. It's a great place to share data. It's a great place to share computational tools. It's very, very fast. It's scalable. So I think just as we're going to be drowning in data, which is sort of a problem, one of the ways we get out of this difficulty is that we're going to have new generations of tools that are far more powerful than any computer systems that we've been used to using in the past.